So, episode 34 of the 1000-Year Blood War arc anime introduced us to Mayuri's new Bankai, Konjiki Ashisogi Jizo Matai Fukuin Shotai, an altered version of his previous Bankai that completely changes its look and ability. As Mayuri uses his Bankai to overwhelm and seemingly defeat Pernida Pankajaz, we get our only look to date at how it actually works, and what its new power can do. So, just how strong is this altered Bankai? When it comes to Mayuri's original Bankai, Konjiki Ashisogi Jizo, despite its terrifying form, I've always thought it to be one of the more underwhelming Bankai in the series, even going so far as to rank it the 7th worst Bankai overall on my most recent ranking, though in hindsight, maybe that's a little harsh. With its ability to spew a toxic gas cloud from its mouth, as well as sprout swords from its chest, Konjiki Ashisogi Jizo has always felt a bit limited in scope to me. Add to that the fact that it's an organic being with all the weaknesses of one as well, and I've never found it all that impressive, outside of its incredible visual design. That's all changed, however, with Mayuri's newly altered Bankai. Many of the new and upgraded Bankai revealed in the 1000-Year Blood War arc are impressive, but Mayuri's is perhaps the most devious and in some ways the most powerful too. All that is to say, it is a serious improvement over the original version, but what exactly does it do? How does Matai Fukuin Shotai work, and how powerful really is it? Perhaps most importantly of all, how can it be countered? Does it have any weaknesses? In today's video, we're going to try and find out. Before we get started on today's video, there will be some spoilers for the rest of the 1000-Year Blood War arc still to come, and if you enjoyed today's video and you want to stay up to date with more videos from me, then make sure to hit that subscribe button down below, as it really does help out the channel, and I really do appreciate the support. So, first of all, what exactly does Mayuri's altered Bankai do? How does it work? Well, as Mayuri activates Bankai against Pernida, his sword gives way to a gigantic monstrosity. Gone is the twisted, cloaked, golden caterpillar with the face of a Jizo from before. Instead, Mayuri's Bankai now takes the shape of a massive purple baby with a deformed head and a swollen stomach. The creature slouched languidly upon a bed of bloody tentacles, the entire abomination bathed in the ethereal, alien pale glow of a pair of lanterns attached to the fleshy mass. Immediately upon being summoned, the purple baby unleashes a guttural roar and clutches its stomach as it suddenly births a brilliant, almost angelic, gleaming golden Jizo, similar in design, albeit simplified overall, to Mayuri's original Bankai. What's interesting here then is that the main body of Mayuri's new Bankai is merely a conduit, a vessel, for the Bankai's actual ability itself. The Matai Fukuin Shotai has the ability to give birth to new Ashisogi Jizo based on information that Mayuri feeds it during battle. When Mayuri first activates Bankai, he notes that his Bankai is finally due. While this is a reference to the theme of birth and creation that surrounds Matai Fukuin Shotai, it also subtly references the fact that Mayuri's altered Bankai can't be activated until he's gathered the requisite data beforehand. And so now at last, he's ready and his Bankai is due, meaning about to give birth. So essentially, throughout combat, Mayuri feeds information on his enemy to his Zanpakuto on a constant basis, and in the background, Ashisogi Jizo begins to build a profile. How Mayuri feeds this data, we don't know, but presumably he just does so telepathically to his Zanpakuto as they are linked. It's interesting because this in itself is another parallel to Pernida, although it's one that we won't become aware of in the anime until the rest of this fight plays out, as Pernida also gathers information on its opponents as the battles play out, only Pernida does so via attaching its nerves to them, allowing it to then evolve over time. However, when ready, Mayuri activates his variant Bankai, and the Bankai then spits out a Jizo that is the perfect counter to the enemy, based on the information that Mayuri has been providing it. It's a really cool power in the sense that it's incredibly meta and very self-aware. As one of Bleach's foremost scientists, Mayuri's fights are often characterized by his ability to be 3 or more steps ahead of his opponent in the most wild and implausible ways, with Kubo giving Mayuri everything and anything he needs to concoct even the most bizarre counters to his enemies. Perhaps one of the most famous examples, and the example that I think encapsulates everything in this video, is in Mayuri's battle with Xyloporo. Based on information provided to him via surveillance bacteria placed inside Uryu, Mayuri learned that Xyloporo had the ability to crush his victim's internal organs one by one. And with less than an hour's worth of prep time afforded to him, Mayuri simply replaced all of his internal organs with dummies prior to arriving to act as the perfect, albeit implausible, counter to Xyloporo's power. It sounds absolutely ludicrous, and of course it is, but by virtue of it being Mayuri, we, the reader, accept it as possible, and the manga doesn't feel the need to elaborate any more than that. You see, what Kubo has done here is take that general idea exemplified best in Mayuri's battle with Xyloporo and simply turn it into the ability of Mayuri's new Bankai, the perfect counter to virtually any power, based on prep time and data gathered. It's Mayuri in a nutshell. As seen in the battle with Pernida, Matai Fukuin Shotai produces a Jizo capable of completely countering and offsetting Pernida's nerves. The shining Jizo is born with its nerves on the surface of its body, which are then divided into 70,000 layers. So, the moment Pernida's nerves attach themselves to the surface of the Jizo's body, that particular layer is simply peeled away, along with Pernida's own nerves, rendering them utterly useless, unless Pernida was somehow able to get through all 70,000 layers before being defeated itself, and of course that doesn't happen. It seems like the number of layers here, 70,000, is just an arbitrary number, a number big enough that we as the reader would believe that Pernida has no chance of succeeding. However, there's even more to it than that. Mayuri reveals that he made a last-minute decision to create a Jizo that was born without teeth. As if it had chewed Pernida up rather than swallow the arms whole, they would have multiplied endlessly. Now, Mayuri only discovered this fact when he used his bomb to separate Pernida's little finger, and right before his eyes, it evolved into a completely new hand, meaning he's able to feed his Zanpakuto information almost up to the very moment he activates Bankai. So yeah, as we can see from the latest episode and the rest of the fight to come yet in the manga, this Bankai does seem pretty crazy on the surface. How do you overcome and defeat the perfect counter? While this is the only example we ever get to see of Matai Fukuin Shotai in action, it's not hard to imagine how it might work against other opponents from the series. Looking at some Shinigami, let's take Hitsugaya for example. Mayuri would simply instruct the Bankai over the course of their battle to create a Jizo that is totally resistant to being frozen. Perhaps its skin instantly melts the ice on contact. Against someone like Kenpachi, Mayuri would instruct the Bankai to create a Jizo that has totally indestructible skin. Would the Bankai be capable of birthing something that Kenpachi literally cannot cut? That's the question we have to ask here. There are some interesting potential matchups to consider for sure beyond even this. Both of the examples I've used so far are Shinigami fighters that are very much focused on physical, tangible abilities and fighting styles. For the most part, they are fairly simplistic. But what if Mayuri came up against someone with a trickier, more abstract fighting style? Someone like Shinji or even Aizen? How would Matai Fukuin Shotai create something based on the information Mayuri sends it then? I guess the key here is that the Bankai will come up with whatever it needs to, depending on the circumstance. Against Shinji Sakanade, for example, the Jizo would likely either lack the sense of smell or sight entirely, or maybe both, meaning it can't be affected by Shinji Shikai whatsoever. And I guess the same would be true for Aizen's Kyoka Suigetsu. A blind Jizo would be unaffected. Taking things a step even further beyond that to someone who has a power even more abstract than the likes of Shinji and Aizen, how would this Bankai counter something like Kyoraku's Katen Kyokotsu and its Bankai? I guess a counter should theoretically be possible, but how do you counter something so wild and unpredictable as a Zanpakuto that makes children's games a reality? Would Mayuri end up creating a Jizo that just wins every children's game it plays? Is that within the bounds of reality here? Moving away from Shinigami against a character like Baragon, who has a very well-defined ability in Respirar, presumably Mayuri would just be able to create a Jizo that doesn't age. The same goes for the Quincy's. It really feels like Mayuri's altered Bankai could feasibly come up with a counter for almost every shrift, save for perhaps the very most broken of the bunch. Because as long as you can think of one, no matter how far-fetched, then that counter is a possibility that's on the table. Against, say, Bambietta's The Explode, Mayuri would create a Jizo whose body can't be destroyed by explosive blasts. I guess it would be similar to Komamura's Dangai Joy. Against Candice's The Thunderbolt, the Jizo would either be unaffected by electricity entirely, it wouldn't conduct it, or would channel the electricity to power itself up. Either way, it would render Candice's power completely useless. These are just a couple of examples, again, of some slightly more straightforward and basic shrift. I do wonder how it would fare against the likes of, say, the X-axis, for instance. If it is a hard and fast rule established in-universe that the X-axis penetrates everything with its destroying shot with no exceptions, then would it be possible to create a counter? Or would Mayuri's Bankai simply work in such a way as to circumvent this rule, to create an exception to the rule that narratively overrides it? And so, in this new made-up future, the X-axis can destroy everything in its line of fire, except for this Jizo. And like I said earlier, I'm not really sure what kind of counter would be feasible for the likes of the Almighty, the Visionary, or even the Miracle. I'm sure with enough time it would be possible to come up with something. But there's no doubt that in a world like Bleach's, where, with the best will in the world, a lot of the fights do come down to someone eventually having the perfect counter to their opponent, especially in the 1000-Year Blood War arc, where some of the abilities do become more abstract. Mayuri wielding the perfect counter to virtually everyone at his fingertips makes him a major player. And so, to go back to the question at the start of the video, how powerful is this new Bankai? To me, it seems like it would be extremely powerful, but there are a few caveats, and even potential weaknesses to explore. So, what weaknesses might this altered Bankai suffer from? Well, the most obvious one is the fact that Mayuri needs to gather data in the midst of combat in order to use it. If Mayuri knows absolutely nothing about his opponent or their power, he can't use the Matai Fukuin Shotai at all. This inherently means he has to wait in order to use this Bankai. It's not a power that can be brought out at the start of a fight. How much of a weakness this really is for Mayuri is unclear, as he is the type to normally have some kind of information at his disposal. But against Pernida right here, we really see him come into contact with something he's never witnessed before and learns about on the fly. So that in itself is another weakness. Mayuri needs to survive long enough in a fight to actually get to use his Bankai. Taking us back to the example of Mayuri using this Bankai against Hitsugaya, well, we actually get to see them fight in the source material when Mayuri takes on the zombified Hitsugaya in his battle against Giselle. And while Mayuri is in control of that fight from the very beginning thanks to his perception-altering drugs, we actually get to see that Hitsugaya, as ruthless as the zombified version is, totally dominates and overwhelms Mayuri in hand-to-hand, close-quarters swordplay and combat, even with Mayuri's Zanpakuto having that hit detector implanted in it. But again, speaking of Hitsugaya, it is very similar to Hitsugaya's mature Bankai in that sense. It's extraordinarily powerful, but Hitsugaya can't use it until his ice petals are completely gone. If he's seriously injured or killed before that, well, too bad. I would argue Mayuri is very resilient in comparison to even most other captains, so again, how much of an issue this really is unclear. But still, crucially, this isn't a Bankai that can be used immediately, unless, of course, Mayuri already knows everything about his enemy. See, that's the funny thing here. It almost feels like a Bankai alteration purpose-built to fight those that Mayuri knows best. In his battle with Pernida, the Bankai doesn't really get to shine because ultimately Pernida still has a number of tricks up its sleeve that Mayuri hasn't seen yet. But if he were to come up against, say, another captain, that gives Mayuri an enormous advantage, and we already know that he has data on every single Bankai in the Gotei 13, meaning they're all dancing in the palm of his hand. Considering Matai Fukuin Shotai is an altered Bankai, an alteration made by Mayuri himself, and clearly not done with Pernida in mind since Mayuri didn't know of Pernida until very recently, then who's to say why he felt the need to alter it? It absolutely wouldn't surprise me if Mayuri created Matai Fukuin Shotai as a form of paranoid insurance, to dangle over his colleagues' collective heads should anyone so much as look at him the wrong way. Anyway, back to the weaknesses, and there are a few that I think are endemic to Matai Fukuin Shotai specifically. Now, we don't get to see this Bankai much, but while it can create a perfect counter, it does appear to have limits. For starters, once the giant purple baby gives birth to a Jizo, it seemingly disappears? Does this mean Mayuri can only create one Jizo at a time? Is there a cooldown to this, or does he simply need to activate Bankai again in order to birth a second one? There's also the fact that once a Jizo has been born, it seems it can't then be modified any further, which I guess makes sense. Mayuri has to get it right the first time round. He needs to ensure that he has all the information necessary to defeat his enemy completely before activating Bankai, or else he's going to summon a Jizo that's half-baked and not really sufficient, which is essentially what happens in his fight with Pernida. So if Mayuri really can only summon one Jizo at a time, then there's definitely a risk-reward element to this Bankai. He needs to collect as much information as possible before committing to creating a new Jizo. On the flip side to that, however, it does seem like just the one Jizo is capable of countering multiple aspects of a single enemy. For this Jizo that we see in the manga counters Pernida's nerves by having the different layers on its skin, but it also counters Pernida's ability to evolve by not having any teeth and therefore not chewing him up. So presumably, again, if Mayuri knows everything about an opponent, let's take Byakuya this time, he could create a Jizo that could counter Senbon Zakura, that could counter Byakuya's Kido prowess that he likes to use, maybe even somehow counter his Shunpo? I've got no idea, but presumably Mayuri could create the perfect ultimate bespoke package for each individual captain. But then there's the fact that once the Jizo is in play, it's ultimately just a big target, a big, albeit terrifying monster baby. At least from the example we get to see, it doesn't really have any fighting capabilities whatsoever. It's just an instinctual, animalistic creature who in this instance was capable of overpowering and devouring an enemy that seemed perfectly suited to fighting it, in the sense that Pernida doesn't really seem capable of moving around or escaping. It was rooted to the ground and enabled the baby to eat it. If it was anyone else, who's to say they couldn't just escape the baby, even if it does counter their abilities? And as we see from the second half of the fight, the Jizo is just an organic flesh creation like the original Bankai, meaning it can be killed as such. Even if the Jizo is entirely dedicated to shutting down a particular ability, if it comes up against an enemy with enough fighting experience, I don't see why they wouldn't just be able to kill it with raw power and skill before moving on to Mayuri himself once again. At the very least, Konjiki Ashisogi Jizo had built-in combat capabilities, such as the swords and the poison. These new Jizo, outside of whatever they are purpose-built to counter, feel very exposed. So it's clear then from this that there's still a lot we don't know about Mayuri's newly altered Bankai. There are more than a few missing variables here, but that's because it's simply not as straightforward as his original Bankai. As for how powerful Matai Fukuin Shotai is, well, that's a difficult one. That really depends on the battle and the scenario at hand. If Mayuri has the data he needs, then it's hard to imagine many abilities or even characters truly capable of standing up to it. After all, that's what it's designed to do. That being said, there's more to it than just that. Even after the ability or the fighter has been rendered null and useless by the Bankai, the Jizo itself that is produced still has to win the fight, or else Mayuri has worked hard for nothing. In the manga, Mayuri's Bankai is defeated here because he didn't take into account something as simple as Pernida being able to use a bow and arrow. Though I honestly wouldn't be surprised if this is changed in the anime to perhaps Pernida escaping and destroying the Jizo by activating its Volston dish, purely because it feels like a really good time to reintroduce it, whereas it didn't exist in the manga. But in regards to how strong it is, well, I definitely think it's a better Bankai than his original one. Not only is it limitlessly versatile, but it's more fitting for Mayuri as a character in that it literally is him in a meta sense. Honestly, depending on the scenario, I think this is one of the most powerful Bankai in the series, but it's tough to say without more detail, as it is very circumstance dependent. Alright guys, but that's it for today's video. I really hope you enjoyed it as always, and I hope you took something of value from it as well. Let me know down in the comments below, how powerful do you think Mayuri's newly altered Bankai Konjiki Ashisogi Jizo Matai Fukuin Shotai really is? Who is he realistically capable of countering, and what limits do you think this Bankai actually has? How well does the Jizo itself fare in battle once all is said and done? And are there any characters that you think Mayuri's new Bankai simply won't work on at all? Let me know down in the comments. I would absolutely love to hear your thoughts. Thank you again so very much for watching, and as always I want to end this video by saying a massive thank you and giving a huge shout out to my wonderful supporters over on Patreon, without who this channel simply wouldn't be possible. If you also like the work that I do here over on YouTube and you want to support me over on Patreon as well, thank you so very much. By supporting me at the $1 tier a month, you can get your name in the credits of every single video like this, alongside everyone who helps to make them possible. And at the $2 a month tier, you can enjoy every video I release absolutely free of those baked-in YouTube ads. Okay everyone, thank you again so very much for watching. Until next time, I'll catch you later, and I'll see you then.